I had a loud voice, but I've got a little bit of a throat problem, so you want me to hold? Hello? Can the people on the last row hear me? You can hear me clearly? No. No. Then I think, can you change the mic on this, please? I don't want to hold it. Pidikan off.
Hello.
Okay, so this one's working. Thank you, Biju, for the invitation. I received this email one day with an invitation to make a presentation here, and then I contacted him and said, do you want me to really talk about feminist research, and what kind of a talk do I give? Because I haven't really self-reflexively thought about the methodology. You know, of course, when I'm doing research, I engage with it, but I don't really teach methodology and so on. So I had to then he gave me free rein. He said, you can talk about whatever. But then I thought that I would, give this title, which is Doing Feminist Research. And I selected 3 themes around which to organize the talk. They are invisibility, social structure, social categories, and the gender binary. Because I think these are themes that, in a sense, take us through a very, very broadly an evolution of feminist concerns and the feminist challenge today to doing research. So today we are confronted with the challenge of actually recognizing that gender is not a binary and that it should really be part of the way we think of feminist research itself. But when we started, and in a sense, this part of feminist research really started with the second wave of feminism. Some of you may be familiar with what I mean by the second wave of feminism, which started roughly in the 1960s and 70s. And it was like global, and all over the world, we were raising feminist activists, advocates, and researchers were raising certain questions related to the kind of work women do, the kind of rights women have. And of course, distinct in some ways from the first wave, when the concerns related to suffrage, women did not have the right to vote at that time and really had to fight for that and have get rights over property, etc. So in the second wave, I thought, when I thought about it, I thought invisibility was a concept that came from feminist research, which actually questioned the received knowledges of that time. Okay, so at that time, we were talking really in the gender binary. We were talking about men and women, and even feminists in the 1960s actually accepted the gender binary. They accepted it and they said it's for science to really look into biology and come up with whatever they find. As far as we are concerned, sex is a binary, gender is a social construction. So they left sex to the biologists, and they said since gender is a social construction, it is diverse, it varies over time, and we deal with gender. But things have changed quite drastically and radically since then. The next slide, please. So I asked this question, what do we characterize as feminist in research? Because to my mind, when I was thinking of feminist research, it was like putting it into a box and putting it somewhere. This is feminist research. It need not concern what we do in the mainstream disciplines. So if you're a political scientist, you're an economist, you study mainstream economic theory, you study political theory, and there's feminist research somewhere. There's some feminist theory. To my mind, feminist theory or feminist research should actually be informing the disciplines, altering the disciplines, because it is bringing certain critical questions of what was left out. the assumptions of these mainstream disciplines. That's what feminist research is questioning. So it should be broadening knowledges, making knowledge systems more responsive to the demands of our times, and so on. So what I say here then is existing knowledge systems do not reflect the realities and concerns of people of non-dominant genders or misrepresent them. I'm going a little ahead in time by using non-dominant genders because they are multiple now, we know, right? But if I were talking, say, in the 1980s, I would say do not reflect the concerns of women. They reflect more the concerns of men. So institutions, and what I mean by institutions are rules, laws, and norms. Okay, the rules by which we lead our lives. Some of them come from laws, some of them come from norms. And we know that norms often have more of an effect on us than laws do. Right? There's a Dowry Prohibition Act, and yet everybody seems to give dowry. So you can see where the norm is different. So institutions and practices are embedded in patriarchal power relations. Manjula spoke about power, right, as being a really key element. And often the disciplines don't recognize power. They don't recognize power in the way institutions are set up or practices become dominant. So it's as if they're just objective, they're there because they're the most efficient, they're natural, they're customary. You find many justifications or legitimizations for practices, laws, etc. They do not really say it is because of the way power is structured. So institutions and practices are embedded in patriarchal power relations, but knowledge systems legitimize them as efficient, customary, and natural. Efficient is a term that comes from my discipline, economics. Okay, everything has to be efficient to stand the test of time. So Gary Becker, in fact, says marriage is an efficient institution. That is why it has survived. And he looks at the two-partner or two-party marriage system and comes up with the specialization and comparative advantage, defining that women specialize in domestic household work and men in outside work. So he says this is an efficient arrangement. He won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. Okay? So this year, of course, we had Claudia Golden, also an economist, a feminist economist, I would say, but I will come to her work a little later, of the liberal persuasion she is. And we can, so that's about the theory that you use, right? So feminists also differ, and they differ quite as radically as they differ from mainstream scholars. So now, institutions shape our choices regarding education, jobs, marriage. They restrict access to property, produce sex ratios. So you can see how institutions, which are often rationalized as efficient or customary or natural, actually restrict the choices that we make. Just consider in India, I think 98 or 99% of people above a certain age are married, of women are married, right? I mean, is that, think of the choice. Think of Japan. Japan is running out of children. Okay? Where people are not getting married. Canada, people are not getting married. The world over, but South Asia is an exception. So what could be the reasons behind the fact that India is such a compulsorily married society? You can't get away from gender and understanding that kind of choice. And in fact, there's data, the NFHS tells us, the Indian Human Development Survey, IHDS data several rounds tell us that only a very small proportion of the marriages that happen in India are actually intercaste or interreligious. Something like 10% are intercaste, 5% are interreligious, and most of them are arranged. Okay, so how does that outcome come about? Right, when you look at data, you can see this outcome, but what leads to that outcome? Right, so there is a shaping, a structuring of our choices. So as far as feminist concerns are concerned, we would want to know, really, do we have a choice in the matter? How does this decision making happen? And is there a certain kind of shaping of choices that in some ways limits our rights themselves, okay? So, skewed sex ratios, one can get into any of these examples, right? But I'm not going to do that in a big way. So, I have plenty of examples as we go along. More examples than abstract stuff. So the male breadwinner family is seen as efficient in neoclassical economics, and marriage, you're a political scientist, right? How is marriage conceived of in the classical contract theories, right? Absolutely necessary. Women need to consent to get into a marriage. Once you get in, you have no rights. That's the classical contract theory, social theory, right? Which marked the movement from a state of nature where there were no property rights, there was no order, to a state of civil society, right? So there is gender right there. There's Carol Pateman's work on the sexual contract, which goes into this in great detail. So thus, feminist research involves engagement with knowledge systems, existing or received knowledge systems, in order to recognize the basis of discrimination and inequality and to represent the claims of women, okay, in the language of the 1960s and 70s. Now, feminist research involves questioning the concepts and frameworks of mainstream disciplines and seeks to arrive at new concepts and frameworks that acknowledge the workings of power. So we need to recognize the workings of power and, think of concepts that will actually acknowledge them. And I think invisibility is a very interesting concept of that kind. I'll get into it in a little while. So issues of concern include discrimination against girls and women, the low value attached to women's work, though it's fundamental to our survival, and lack of recognition of the concerns of women. And women's concerns often are welfare-related concerns. Just think of the Panchayati Raj. The Welfare Standing Committee is the least powerful standing committee, right? And until all standing committees had to have women's representation, at least in, from time to time, so you couldn't leave women out, women were mostly put into the Welfare Standing Committee. Now, invisibility is a key feminist concept that refers to the non-recognition of people, activities, or concerns as a result of dominant institutions. So, the disappearance from view within these dominant knowledge systems of women. You can find many places that women simply don't exist. So, when you're looking at the disciplines, in the 1960s, you would say they're there in sociology and anthropology because they deal with the household. But they didn't seem to be anywhere else, not in the economy, though in fact if you looked at the census even in the early 20th century, women's work participation rates were higher than they are today. Okay, and yet the disciplines, so that's empirical, but the disciplines in their theorization didn't seem to deal with the concerns of women. So the second wave of feminism brings women in, or demands that women be brought into the picture, which is a project of recognition. That you need first to recognize that they are there and are of consequence to the economy or to the polity or to society. So now here, the next slide please. I think I missed a slide for you I was reading out. Yeah, no. The one with the picture, the colorful picture. Some of you may recognize it. Do any of you recognize this picture? Can you see it with any clarity? Huh? Do you recognize this? Okay, so this was like written about quite a lot in 2020, and it's a painting, a picture that was drawn by a 14-year-old boy. And he titled it, "The Work My Mother and Others' Mothers in the Neighborhood Do." Okay? And it was the cover of the gender budget document in 2020. So if you can see it, I mean, okay, so they've expanded it. You can see the range of work that a mother does. And this boy has actually used his mother as an example here. And she's doing everything. I mean, this would take actually more than 24 hours if I had to do this work. Okay, but she's doing all of this, obviously, and managing to get a little sleep too, I hope. And so you can see her cooking. Broadly, if I want to characterize it, it would be cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Right? All the work that she's doing. Now, of course, this is being done in a rural setting in Kerala, but if you were to transport it somewhere else, you'll still see a range of unpaid work that mostly women and mothers do. So this was very interesting because it's the observation of a young boy. And observation is very important to research, right? Where do our questions come from? They come from experience, from observation, or from in a more structured way from reading of literature, etc. So this could well be the starting point of research, right? This boy has actually mapped out for us so much of the unpaid work that women do, but observation is not enough. We need something more there. We need to know what are the concepts that these disciplines use. What are the frameworks? So you need to know the theory and the concepts. So when you put it together with the theory and the concepts, then there's a problem here. So let me just problematize it for you. So product. The 3 C's, all of this that was put up, none of that goes into the GDP. That's not production under the GDP. It's not considered. So, but what is the nature of these activities? In an economy that actually is constituted not by any of this, we need to know why, right? Is this not of importance to the economy? Do you think the work that whoever could have done it, you could have had there are some men also who do it, but is it of consequence to the economy? No. Why? Does anybody think it's not of consequence to the economy? Huh? I think I've lost all of you. Is the work that is done at home of consequence? Huh? Okay, so nobody's venturing out. So basically, the reason that it's not included is because it's unpaid work. Nobody's paying a woman to do this work, right? So you don't have a readily available value that is attached to it that can be put in. But that's not the fundamental reason. This is a difficulty. The fundamental reason is that it's seen that these are all services. You don't see any, like in factories, you produce an output, right? Here, you don't see the production of an output. Maybe cooking, you produce food, but then, it's not substantive, it's not seen as substantive production. So, it's seen basically as services which are consumed at the point of production itself, and therefore, it's not included. Therefore, all of this work and the women doing this work are invisible. They are invisible from the way the economy is conceptualized and the way we talk about the gross domestic product. Now I'll come to some of the complications of this. So what is this national economy and what is the GDP? So the typical conceptualization is that there is a private sector. We all know the private sector, right? Then there's the government, which is the public sector, and then there are households. Whereas the government and the private sector are known to produce and consume, the households are known only to consume. They do not produce, in theory. So can we think of something that households produce which is absolutely fundamental to the survival of an economy or to anything, to a polity, to a society, absolutely fundamental, which is produced in households? What is that? All of you, right? All of you, when you start, there are teachers here, they're working, so it produces labor power. Labor power is not seen as something that's produced. It's seen as something that's readily available. That's how our economy is conceptualized. Because it's women who are doing the work of producing labor power from day to day. You go expend that labor power, you come back, and it's reproduced so that you can go again and expend it, right? And from generation to generation. So that's the way women are rendered invisible to the economy. And the work that women do is also rendered invisible. So that's, again, yeah. So how have feminists seen this? And what are the kind of concepts? One of them is invisibility, but how have they, theorized the economy? So feminists have tried to alternatively theorize the economy, building on the fact that this is a big omission. So what about the production? The question, of course, is what about the production and reproduction of labor power? Why does women... so I already answered that, right? Obviously, it's of importance, but even when our economy becomes 5 trillion, it will still not have the most important component which is necessary for all our survival, right? We cannot survive without labor power. Now, another very important question that feminists have taken up, and that is economists have taken up, is why does women's labor market behavior differ from that of men? Now, you found that this mother was doing all these things, right? In that picture. Do you think she'd have any time left over to go to the labor market and work for pay? I mean, if in that condition, very unlikely. And yet a lot of women are doing that and going and working, right? Very poor women have to manage that. So you have to reduce it, compress it, etc., and then go and work also. But it's been observed that women's labor market behavior is extremely different from that of men. But, you know, if women and men are, as economists think of them just as actors on the market, right? When they don't acknowledge gender. So if they are the same, then why should their labor market behavior differ systematically? Not like Manjula was talking about rigorous research, right? Which must come up with systematic patterns and so on. Why does it differ systematically? So, how we understand this, I'll get into that in a moment, but how we understand women's and men's labor market behavior would depend on the ideological positions of scholars. And that's where I mentioned Claudia Golden, who's actually worked exactly on this theme, and she's a liberal feminist. So she's the one, in fact, who talks about women's labor market behavior as being structurally different in the sense that when you're in a subsistence economy, women and men participate equally in the agriculture sector. And most of it is not for pay. And everybody has to work. But then as you start moving with industrialization into an economy where there's a factory or where there are factories, so the manufacturing sector comes up, then women move into the household and men go out into work. Right? There are rather few women who go into factory work, but women tend to go out. And that's why you have a U shape. So women are working, so work participation is high at the lowest levels of economic development. As economic development grows, fewer women are working. So there's a dip. And then as growth takes root, you know, and you have more and more economic growth, women's participation increases. So according to Golden, it's when the service sector comes into play and expands that women come out and work. And she's very interesting because she also brings in another concept that is very important to feminist research, that of, you know, how does society see it when women take part in outside work? Not the professional, educated women like us, like Manjula and me and the teachers here. You know, we get respect because we are teachers or we are professors. We get respect. But when a woman goes and works in a factory, how is she seen? There's stigma, right? She is seen as needing to work because her husband cannot take care of her. So stigma is something that actually affects the husband also. And so there is a rationale for the husband, or there's a motivation for the husband to prevent her from going. So stigma is another concept that comes in here that feminists have to deal with very closely. So now, if you go by just Claudia Golden's theory, once you have the expansion of the service sector, you have economic growth taking root, women's work participation should really increase. But has that happened in India? It hasn't. Not only is it low, but in the last 20 years, we've even seen decline. So, you know, what is the problem with Claudia Golden's theory? And here, I want to come to a point about methodology, the kind of theory that Claudia Golden works with, which is liberal feminist theory, right? She's an economist, she's an economic historian working with liberal feminist theory. So what liberal feminism believes is that gender does not operate in the external realm. It does not operate on the labor market. It does not operate in the political domain outside. It operates in the family. And because it operates in the household of the family, it contaminates these other domains. So it's not sui generis there in the labor market. So liberal feminists believe if you empower women. You give them education, they will go out into the market, get employment, and they'll be able to achieve equality on their own. So you only need the development of the market. You do not need any government intervention to actually get rid of gender inequality. So that's liberal theory. You only need to equip women with what it takes to operate on the labor market. So all the discrimination they see is because women are less educated than men. Men have more human capital. Women have less human capital. So you find discrimination. So they do not see the labor market or the demand, what economists call the demand side, which is employer discrimination. They do not see employers as discriminating. Okay, so that's the framework, and within that framework, you cannot explain the Indian example because you've had economic development and growth, but women's labor market behavior is not corresponding to what the theory said. And that's where, even in the American case which she takes, there is the you, but other feminists belonging to other perspectives have criticized her. For instance, when you go into the labor market and you with education, you get these professional service sector jobs, what happens to the burden of domestic work? Do we actually find that in the American context that there is sharing of domestic work between partners? No, we don't. So the assumption there is that you have enough, you're earning enough to actually replace or substitute your work in the home with somebody else. And that's where the critics come in. And they tell you about how economies are not just clubbed into the nation state and all, they're global economies. And in America, who are they? In the 1960s and 70s, it was racialized labor. It was the labor of black women that were actually taking care of the children of white privileged women. And subsequently, after the 1970s, it's women from the less developed countries. So we now have international migration, women going from countries like ours. Of course, from India and Kerala, they don't go to the US, but they go to the Middle East, right, as care workers. But from the Philippines, they go to America. And therefore, American women are actually able to get childcare at very low cost. They're able to get childcare at very low cost because the women who go and provide that childcare, their children, what is happening to their children? They're not getting the mother's care, but they are being taken care of not for pay, by the extended family, by the neighborhood. Somebody's taking care of them. You don't have to pay, right? And so what the white woman is paying this racialized, ethnicized labor is far below its market value in America, if you had to actually get childcare there, right? So you're able to, this is the case even with factories. Factories are outsourced, right? At one time, factories were in America, then they went to Mexico, then they went all over the world. Now you find them, these are multinational companies, they're there in India. Why? Low-cost labor, right? You wouldn't get labor at that price in your own country. But that low-cost labor is barely paid at survival rates in these countries, and you're compelled to work because otherwise you don't have an option, right? So that's what happens here. And this has theory built into it. Now, Gloria Golden obviously doesn't see that aspect of racialized labor coming into America, etc. So she puts her faith into the market and actually thinks that, when the market expands, women will be able to go, and that would be a universal theory. It's expected to happen across the globe, but it doesn't really stay in practice. In the Indian context, of course, we have a current debate going on about the demand side and the supply side among feminists themselves, because there are feminists who say the problem that is keeping female labor participation low is that women are not able to go because they have childcare and domestic responsibilities. Where on the demand side, they say, no, it's not that. Employment is not available. There's no employment available, and therefore women are not able to work. Women want to work but are not able to find work. Now, of course, there's a question of, is employment available? If you look in Kerala, and I've done lots of field work, there are women from Bengal and Assam and Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand all coming to work here. But the woman in Kerala is educated, right? So she doesn't want to do that work. So it's also about what we think is suitable employment, and is that available? So that's just a thought. Oh, sorry. So just to sort of close this, there's another feminist who's written extensively on these issues, Diane Elson, and she says the challenge is, first, we need to recognize that all that unpaid work is of value to the economy, and we need to monetize it. We need to reduce, which is, as much of that work that can be compressed using technology, to some extent, but also not doing things that you need not, but also scale. One woman can take care of many children. You don't need every woman staying at home and taking care of the children, right? If you have a childcare organization, you can have that. And you need to redistribute, which means men and women need to do that work. So that would be an alternate conceptualization of the economy. So first I dealt with alternate concepts, invisibility, invisibility, and stigma, recognition of another concept of importance. Now, an alternate conceptualization of the system itself. So it's not just about some work here, some work there. It's systemic. The entire system produces this kind of outcome. So we need to really alternatively conceptualize the system and then bring it into being. Now, to come to governance. Right, you all are political scientists, so I thought I would take an example there. Now, we know that women's voice was largely missing from the governance domain because we didn't have women in the governance domain, right? Even today in the Lok Sabha and the assemblies, a very small proportion of the representatives are women. It's only in the panchayats that women have come in a big way. And we have seen a change. We've seen that there is much more emphasis today on welfare. And welfare, by welfare, I'm just using a catch-all term. It includes everything from women's security, the kind of infrastructure that benefits women, water, immunization of children, the range of things that women have a close connection with. Now, the problem here is that when your representatives don't know or don't have a close association with a whole large domain of activities, they are not able to bring that into governance. So it's only women who know the importance of getting water at the point of use. The man doesn't know that she has to walk so long and pick up that water or the fuel wood or whatever else and bring it. The woman knows how important it is to have safe roads, lighting, because violence will reduce if you have safe transport. To have transport on time. Transport is often dictated by the requirements of men, who are the main workforce. So, when do women need transport? When do women actually need, and to go where? That's not factored into our planning. But when women get into governance, all of this will also come into our systems. And therefore, welfare actually gets more representation. Now, I also found a very interesting point here about women's unpaid work and stable governance. And this is from Diane Elson's theory of an alternative conceptualization of the economy, which is also partly, tells us about how a polity works or a state governance works. Because what she says is that women not only produce goods at the household, for consumption, but the way that they bring up children instills values in them, right? Where do we learn our values? I think Manjula asked that. We learn our values. Where do we learn our values? We learn them at home, we learn them in school, we learn them in the neighborhood. But what is the point about values? Imagine if we did not learn these values of how to behave, how to be so-called good people, how to observe the rules, why the law is important. What would happen? There'd be no respect for property right? And we'd be going and stealing. We don't know. And there'd be complete chaos. Now, feminist Diane Elson also acknowledges that the values that we learn are patriarchal values, which they are. We learn how girls should sit, how girls should be respectful. But in that sense, patriarchy is the glue that keeps our economy and polity together. Because we become disciplined human beings, right? And questioning of patriarchy doesn't mean anarchy. It means a movement away to a more representative, more just kind of order. Okay, so I just wanted to mention a recent publication by Nancy Fraser, who's a feminist political scientist, called Cannibal Capitalism, where she goes beyond Diane Nelson's work. Diane Nelson's work is mainly talking about labor power that is produced but not recognized in our conceptualization of the economy. But Nancy Fraser talks about how capitalism, the system and what the economists would call the economy, is cannibalistic insofar as it survives off care work, which is not paid for, the environment, air, water, pollution. We don't pay for any of this, right? We just extract. It's all free. Public power, regulation, infrastructure, and unfree labor. And this is, she uses unfree labor to say, she says, when Marx conceptualized capitalism, he talked about free labor. Free labor basically as being, you're moved out of bondage and you can sell your labor power on the market, but you're exploited. That was the conception of free labor. But she says that free labor actually free rides on unfree labor. And I mentioned this unfree labor already. The care workers who go from the Philippines to the US, the racialized labor who provides low-cost labor for white women for childcare so that the white woman can go and work on the market, right? So this is a conceptualization from a political scientist in what she calls is a moment of acute crisis, where we really have to rethink our capitalism and recognize that none of this is actually free. We're going to pay the price if we don't recognize where this comes from, because this is not infinite. Even care work is not infinite. If you do not replenish it, Diane Nelson says, you will run out of care work, because women are rational beings and they'll make decisions not to provide. One, not to have children. Two, simply not to provide that care work and so there's a role for the state as well. So that's just, I hope you're getting the broader methodological points that are there, because this is about theory and how theory has conceptualized economies and polities, right? In a way that has left out women and their activities. So you need to bring those people, those actors or those agents and those activities in and those concerns in, if you really have to have a representative economy, polity, society. Now, another really key aspect for gender scholars, and which again involves invisibility, is mobility. If you think of mobility, mobility is in fact something that is acutely important to understanding gender. Because women's mobility has to be curbed, right? Women's mobility is controlled. Controlled, it's monitored. Women are not allowed free mobility. Whereas men are expected to be mobile. Men are expected to go out in the evening, stand on the road, talk. Women are all inside, right? We see it all around us. Right? So mobility is a key aspect of control over women, and therefore it's a really key concept when we think of feminist research. So it's an important aspect of gender reflected in control. Now, this can be applied to our understanding of migration patterns, the meanings that migration has. So you can think, one, of internal migration, right? We all see the interstate migrant labor. We call them Bengali, we call them Hindikar, right? We see them everywhere. In Trivandrum, I see them. I've done fieldwork in Perambavoor, where there are more migrants than Malayalis living in some places. So they're visible all around us. But do you see women? Do you see Bengali women? Do you see Assamese women? We can't tell them apart. A young girl who took me out asked me whether I was from Kerala, so you can't really tell us apart. But there's a class dimension that can tell us, right? But do we see women? Nobody's answering. They answered you, no, Manju? I don't think I'm going over their heads. I'm making it really simple. Huh? Do we see women? Have any of you all seen migrant women? Have you seen migrant men? Yes, okay. Are they invisible? Why don't we see them? I was struck by this because I also rarely see migrant women. But now I've started seeing them. Okay, so I'll give you another example. There's a lady, she's a convent sister who works on international migration of domestic workers. And she keeps seeing these migrant domestic workers at Hyderabad airport, okay? She sees queues of them and lines of them. Nobody else seems to see them. So somehow, I think there's a way in which we see, right? They are there. But are we able to recognize them? Do we even engage with them? Do we speak to them? When she sees one, she will go and see, where are you from? You come from this place. Okay, where are you going? Make sure you have your passport. You have this visa. You need to know this. Take this t-shirt. It has all these instructions. So she knows. She can, within a second, she can tell you who's a domestic worker going overseas. But we can't recognize these women. They're not there in as large numbers as these men, but they're definitely there. So when I went to Perumbavoor, and I spent the first 2 weeks, and then I started seeing them everywhere. I started seeing the children everywhere. And I could tell that these are Bengali children. These are not Malayali children. Okay? And they're segregated. They're spatially segregated. And in that sense, they're kept out of view also. So there's an invisibility that comes there as well. Okay? So, now, there is family. If you look at the data is what we do, right? Manjula also talked about data, the NSS, etc. We look at to understand patterns of migration. So there we'll see that women's migration is minuscule in scale. It's a very small proportion. And therefore it tends to disappear. But then I go to Perumbavoor and I see so many women there. So what do? I need to somehow convince this data system also, right? That either they are missing something or I have to get this out of that data system. Because I am seeing it. What do? I know they are there in Perumbavoor. Now, if I look at the national scale, I'm not going to see them. Because they're not everywhere. Right? I know that they're in certain source regions of Jharkhand and Bengal. I know that in Murshidabad, if I do a survey, it's going to come up in a big way. So I need scale. India is a large country. Philippines is a very small country. So you see 80% of migrants are women. India is a large country with so many men going. 5% are women, but count them in numbers. We may reach very close to Philippines, right? And because it's only 2% or 5%, we think you don't need policy for them, right? So you need scale. So that's also, I'm proceeding from the fact that I've seen them, the data is not responding, I need to find a match between these two. I need to know how to extract this from my data. Because otherwise these people, the demographers and all, or economists who deal with the data will say, no, sorry, data is not saying it, it doesn't exist. I can't just take them to Perumbavoor and say, look. They say, but that's because it's only in a small place. But there are several small places, and they call them, I'm doing work currently with an economist colleague who says, oh, those are hotspots. Okay? So I said, now I have to take you to each hotspot. Let's scale it down. Okay? And then they become visible. Right? So how do we go about actually constructing our problems, which will bring these concerns to the fore? So duration is also the length to which you migrate. And the literature actually tells us that if you're looking at long-term migration, there are more men. But if you're looking at very short-term, very vulnerable kind of migration, there are more substantial numbers of women who migrate. Type of migration, again, whether it's family or single migration. And so you'll find that when you look at family migration, there are large numbers of women who are workers. They come as family, but they work. Then international migration, again, male-dominated statistics. Again, there's I'm trying to get at how do we raise research questions, okay? How is our curiosity sort of set off? So when you look at the statistics, it's male-dominated. Very few women migrating as labor. But then in my newspaper, I'm constantly reading about how these women are exploited in the Gulf. Now, who are those women? They're not appearing in the data. But they seem to hog the headlines. So there's something wrong again. Again, scaling down, or looking for data at the destination, but also looking for why is it that our data is not reflective, going beyond scaling down. And this is something, because I've worked on this area, I do know, because of our policy, international migration policy is extremely restrictive of women who do domestic work or less educated women. So they have many conditions in order to migrate legally. Therefore, women migrate illegally. See, they will not be in your data. right? But that doesn't mean that they're not migrating. They're migrating. But you're not getting them the data, and you're going along pretending that they're not there. So this is again a huge concern for women or feminist scholars and gender scholars. Okay, now where is this? Gender. I think I have. Okay. So how do we, okay, thinking again about mobility. Now, one question that arises then is, how do we define these analytical frameworks, right? What are analytical frameworks? Analytical frameworks, which are also explanatory frameworks, which we then build our theory with, right? So how do we build them? So we need to then make connections. And I've made several of those connections for you already. We need to make connections. Say I start with policy, a restrictive policy, the kind of effects that it has and how it affects your data. Right? And it also how it affects the labor market in the destination and the experiences of women. So those are the connections that I make. Gender norms also define the acceptability of migration for women. So at the source, because we have a social system in which women going abroad on their own is not acceptable. It speaks poorly about her husband. So her family will try and restrain her. So that's a set of connections also that will reduce the numbers of women going or make them go through illegal routes in defiance of patriarchy. You find that there are many cases where women actually go to escape patriarchy. They are abused women and they go, right? So these things will not come up through the mainstream kind of research. Now, public policy restrictions on women's mobility as an extension of social norms and family patriarchy. So I spoke about policy, right? The state's, the Indian government's policy. So a restrictive policy is actually just an extension of social norms, right? It's family patriarchy extended at the level of the nation, which says women cannot go, because you then need to ask, and I think I asked it in the previous slide, you also need to ask, if women are restricted, why are men not restricted, right? Why are only certain classes of women restricted? So those are questions I'll come to in a little while. Indian versus Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a large sending country. Scale is small. That's why I had that indication. Now, gender problematics in public politics, and this is, I've taken some time, right? So maybe I can skip this. But this would be of interest to you all. It's about student politics, and I wanted to talk about how we bring gender into student politics beyond looking at how many are elected, how many are voters, right? And I wanted to talk about what we call the body politic, right? How the politics, student politics, affects the way girls appear in a college, what they're allowed to wear, how they're allowed to behave, what they're punished for. Not by the principal necessarily, but by their compatriots, by their students. They can be maybe bullied in an engineering college. They told me that girls prefer to wear a uniform. In some colleges they wear a uniform, but where they don't wear a uniform, the principal actually told me, if they come dressed in a way that's not acceptable, the boys will bully them into conformity. Okay, so there are ways in which the body politic gets shaped. And that's an important gender problematic. And here, as well as in the case of migration or any other thing, we need to talk about the protection of women as bodies versus the protection of women's rights. These are two very different things, and they're very important as far as feminist research is concerned. We need to differentiate between protection of us as bodies, which can mean, just lock them up in a room, and protection of our rights. Go out and work and ensure that you have every right that a worker is supposed to have. Okay. Now, the second aspect that I wanted to deal with was social structure. So you cannot today think about women as an independent or autonomous kind of category. Women will disappear. There's no such category as woman today. There are only women of privilege, women who are oppressed, and the categories that lead to oppression and privilege are many. There's race, there's class, there's caste, there's ethnicity, there's religion, right? So we need to bring in other social structures. And there is then what is called intersectionality. All these categories intersect to define the identities of women and men. So who we are, how we are positioned, depends on the intersection of categories that position us at a particular place. So women are not monolithic, but are differentiated by other social structures and categories, recognition of intersectionality in the design of feminist research problems, design of analytical frameworks, and in the interpretation of findings. I've already mentioned in the case of Claudia Golden how racialized labor came in, right? So you can see how, white women benefit from racialized women, and then women from the least developed countries coming in. So that's intersectionality. But also, and this is my work, the work that I did on international migration of women, you find that, who are these women who migrate in these tough conditions? They are women of the oppressed castes, of the poorer classes, of specific ethnicities, and who come from particular spatial areas, not from everywhere, and who are poorly educated. But when I looked at Kerala, I found another distinguishing feature. I found that most of them are what I called outside marital protection, which meant they were either not married or divorced or separated or what you call abandoned. The term abandoned itself is highly loaded. Manjula referred to feminist research being value-laden. Actually, mainstream is value-laden because we often don't look at the assumptions of the mainstream. It's the mainstream that categorizes women as abandoned. Abandoned? How do you get to be abandoned? You're abandoned by a man. Does that identify you? It's only when you recognize marriage as of key importance you become abandoned, right? If you didn't, you're not abandoned by yourself, right? So that term itself comes from the framework, right? So feminist research involves actually questioning those kind of terms that I use. Left behind women, unwed mothers, all of these come from mainstream frameworks, and it is the task of feminist research really also to take up these concepts and question them and say what are the frameworks they come from and do they actually reflect our realities. And if they do constrain us, it's because our system supports an institution like marriage. That's why it affects us. Now, social structures intersect to define the social and economic position of women and men and their identities. Control over women is necessary for the reproduction of class and caste identities. I'll make a quick point here, and that's again very important to feminist research. And that is, I already mentioned the IHTS data and how it shows that intercaste marriages are very small. Right? After 70 years of independence, we don't often hear this, 70 years of independence, people are still marrying in their own castes, in their own subcastes. Why? I mean, educated people are still marrying in their own castes and subcastes. So there's something wrong, right, if that continues to happen. So we need to understand that caste as a framework can continue only if there's control over women. If women are actually permitted to go and marry anybody they like, they will marry you across caste. That's why we have honor killings, right? To deter women from going out and marrying anybody they may actually like. And that's why we have all kinds, levels of control over women. Then there's also this whole question of who is a woman. If you're not married, you will be asked, Ninakkoru jeevitham vende. I mean, give me a break. I'm living, I'm talking, I'm walking, I'm eating, and I don't have a life. Is a man ever asked, Ninakkoru jeevitham ille? For those who don't understand Malayalam, don't you want a life? If you're not married, people in Kerala will ask you, don't you want a life? So a life, actually, and that has, and these idioms are powerful, extremely powerful. A woman who's not married is talked about as left behind, orinju poi. In southern Kerala, irunnu poi. Mobility. Our speech actually is very, very potential. It reflects power, right? Irunnu poi, ninnu poi. You're not mobile. How are you mobile? When you get married, then you move up. Right? Mobility in our language, just in something like a static institution of marriage. I think it's static, but yeah. But it talks about how you move. So you move from daughter to wife to mother. Even if you stop at wife, you will still be subject to stigma. Makkalaille? Ayo? These questions. So, fruition of womanhood comes only when you follow this trajectory fully, right? So who is a woman itself is in contention going beyond social categories into these marital categories as well. I think I've covered these things, yeah. Now, binary gender, okay, the last question. And this is something that is like sort of looming over us today. We are compelled and we are challenged to take this up and bring it into our research. That gender is no longer, we can no longer accept gender as a binary, whether on the basis of science or on the basis of social experience. Today, finally, mainstream science has been so compelled, they've lost, they first looked at the bodily structure and said duality, then they looked at hormones and said duality didn't work, then they looked at chromosomes. Even chromosomes do not stand up to the test, because none of us have done the chromosomal test, right? Because chromosomal patterns are so varied. So none of this. So this master Y chromosome just doesn't tell it all, okay? So binary gender does not stand up whether on the basis of science or on the basis of social experience. Feminist research must also be aware of the politics of binary gender. Gender boundaries are policed to maintain dominant power relations embedded in heterosexuality and this institution of marriage. So we all know, what does binary gender serve? It serves this institution of heterosexual marriage. And that's why it's so important to hold on to. And there's wokeism in America now, right? The American right is questioning wokeism precisely on these grounds. The recognition of transgender and non-heteronormous identities is a challenge for the existing institution of marriage. Feminist research must attend to the questions posed by people of non-dominant gender and sexual identities to understand the challenges they pose to dominant institutions. And there's a need to examine experiences of people of non-dominant genders and the changes being wrought by questioning the institutions. So I will close with that. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. This session is thought-provoking.
Made by deconstruction in feminism.
I don't know, I think did it answer? I think, I mean, the way I understand it intuitively, it is obviously questioning the category, a monolithic category.
Yes.
Right? You're testing me? He said yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, he said yes when I said yes. So but I also think that, non-binary gender is another level at which you do this. Yeah.
At the very outset, you pointed at the danger of looking at feminist research as an appendage to the existing dominant disciplines. So the way in which culture mediates the notion of labor. When I read the work of Maitri Prasad about the Perumbavoor and other areas, the way in which the Bengali workers are paid and the way in which the Malayali trade unions are negotiating in cultural terms. So the way in which Marx looked at the issue of labor and the way in which today the disciplines of economics and other disciplines look at it. What was considered as part of the superstructure has come to our understanding of the base itself. So that's the way in which I look at it. When I look at the work of you and Devika from within the paradigm of research that was set by CDS also, I come across this problem. Normally we couch in the language of qualitative and quantitative research, but more than that, what we now call cultural studies or something else, wherein all these factors are taken in. So my query is, as you rightly pointed out, it's not a particular study about a particular section, but the whole notion of objective gaze of the discipline is being problematized by feminist research. For instance, Sabarimala, when this, imposed migration. Ayyappan was an adopted child. When they had their own so-called, from within the compulsive heterosexual family, they had their own child. They somehow managed to, throw him away to the forest. So the transgender people here are identifying with Ayyappan more out of this identification with that grief of Ayyappan. Being thrown out of the family. And as you know, internal migration in India of transgenders from Kerala happens to Bangalore and other places out of such a situation. So I'm wondering, how do you look at the discipline of economics, which to me is so hard to escape the limits of liberalism. Even when I look at Amartya Sen's notion of well-being, it's limited to the unit of individual. So is it more difficult for people working from within economics to break out of this compared to other disciplines? That's my, experiential question.
So institutional and new institutional feminists do raise these questions. So it's a new institutional feminist, Nancy Folbray, who talks about racialized labor. Paula England, who's a sociologist but does related work in economics, also talks about racialized labor in America. And I think that provides a framework for understanding not just caste. In fact, the question of migration is very important because it tells us what I've done fieldwork recently, and I've written some work, which actually tells us that it is that moment of migration that brings all the Malayalis together. So it becomes Malayali as one identity shaped by human development. So we are clean, we are educated, we are healthy people. We know we are rational people. We have only 2 children or 1 child. Vis-a-vis the migrant who is unclean, dirty, who, is not worth associating with. And therefore their children cannot go to the Anganwadis because they'll mix with our children, right? So you see how the lines get drawn. Now migration is a new feature. It's come in. And you see that social categories are put into play. You now have to figure out, all Malayalis have suddenly made common cause. They were so differentiated. And now, but when you're talking about the migrant labor, they all speak in one language. So that's all I have to say. Otherwise, okay.
Ma'am.
Any questions from the students?
Ma'am.
Yeah.
Hello. Ma'am.
Yeah, sorry.
So, is feminism all about middle class, light, uplifting, or is it actively intervening in uplifting marginalized women? For example, recently, in the current scenario, there's lot going on in Gaza or the war-affected Palestine. So, women are going through all unwanted things like toxic shock syndrome and unwanted hygiene problems and all. So, do you think feminist organizations are actively intervening in resolving their problems?
That's a question that I am not able to answer. I don't know which, but I would imagine that there are a lot of human rights organizations, right, that are raising their voice. And I would think feminist organizations are among human rights organizations. UN Women is a feminist united UN organization. I would believe that they're there. But to the early part of your question, I want to say that feminism doesn't belong to anybody, any one section or any one group. Or it's not something that I hold and you can come. No. When Dalit feminism came up, it's because Dalits decided to change feminism, right? And to say that this doesn't belong just to the middle class, it belongs to us as well. And there are questions of relevance to us which are not asked in a way that brings our experience in. So it is for us to intervene with our social experience. Like economics doesn't belong to anybody, it doesn't belong to the mainstream, right? There's going to be a constant challenge. The fact that Claudia Golden has got the Nobel Prize itself is a small concession. It's a liberal economist that has got it, but it's still a woman who's raised feminist questions, right? So from there, it's a small window that you can broaden and bring in other things. So these are like, it's a discipline acknowledging certain challenges. So also feminism began with the middle class, right? With not just the middle class, the white middle class, right? But then today we have a recouping of history. We look at the nationalist movement, or we look at the report on, there was a national committee formed before independence. And there was a report on women, which is so radical. It actually questions marriage in such a radical way, right? It actually, and if you look at the caste structure, marriage was far less an oppressive institution at the lowest levels because women had free exit. There was no property relations holding them together, right? So in the 1940s report was far more radical than towards equality in 1971. Okay? So it doesn't belong to anyone else. I mean, that's me.
Thank you.
Hi ma'am, my question is this: how can feminist research helps to contribute policy changes and developing more equitable and inclusive society?
How can it do that? Of course, the research has to be rigorous, has to be evidence-based, etc. That's one part. And I think there is quite a lot of research today that is evidence-based and quite convincing if you look at that. Is that leading to adequately to policy change? I would say no. Because there is a power relation there as well. Right? Who are the policy makers? Are they willing to take that step? Right? So it's much more complicated. How do you get in there? How do you ensure? But there are important changes that have come up, right? And they come up in places where people at the higher levels of policy making or at governance don't think it's so important. So you had reservation coming at the local self-government level, but you didn't have it coming at the higher levels. And now when it's come up in the bill which was passed, it's come up in a vague, very nebulous, vague, indefinite kind of way, right? We don't really know whether it will take effect. There's no certainty on it. So power works there as well. But we have to keep trying.
Madam, there is one simple question I have. Can we generalize invisibility, the notion of invisibility, in the case of India, as we are living in a land of heterogeneity? We are divided into, even though we will call India as a land of unity and diversity, there are heterogeneous cultures. Can we generalize in the case of India? All women are invisible, especially while we are talking about the women of northeastern states of India. I think I came to know that the Naga women are more they are more visible and they are hardworking, while compared to their men. Their men are more lazy and they are engaged in certain entertainments only. Their women are working hard and they are managing their families well. And this is one case. And while we are talking about the migrant Tamil workers here in Kerala, we usually see that unlike the Bengalis, the women section of the Tamil people who are working here, they are more active and they are engaged in all kinds of works here. They are treated equally with their men. And so by citing these examples, I would like to know that whether it is can be generalized. Invisibility can be generalized in the case of India. We can generalize it, maybe generalize in the case of UK or Philippines-like countries, as Madam mentioned before. So I think more than invincibility is also a question to be taken into account while telling about these kinds of things. I think I'm just forwarding it is as a simple doubt. I have discussed it with my friend, especially the women of northeastern states. And let us have a comparison of the Bengali women who are here and the Tamil migrant women laborers who are here.
You've got a good topic for research, but anyway. And you know, but I
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
I don't think you can generalize anything. But invisibility, I took invisibility as an example of a concept that was very powerful, especially when we started with feminist research in the 1960s and 70s, because women were missing. Okay, so they can be, like I said, when you scale down, then you may find them, right? So there are some places from where women are migrating for work. There will be Meghalaya where the markets are full of women. But at the national level, you did not find them in the data systems. And the picture that I showed you, all that work is invisible because it's not contributing to GDP, right? So that's work that women do and it's invisible. So invisibility is a useful concept, therefore. The question about Naga women, you know, I would beware of stereotypes. Because you have the stereotype of the hardworking migrant and the lazy local, right? These are stereotypes. We should not resort to stereotypes. We should go and inquire. Because I didn't find that the migrants were hardworking and the locals were lazy. Locals were, making the migrants into an opportunity to make money. They had built rooms which they were renting. They were doing surveillance so that they feared that the migrant will create trouble. So they had 24 hours of work to do to get the money. They were getting money out of the migrants. So I wouldn't say they're lazy. They're quite alert to the opportunities they have and so on. So and this is for everybody, steer clear of stereotypes. You know, stereotypes tell you something is wrong. You need to look into it. I think I've answered that. Okay.
One more question. Even though women have achieved education and are achieving independence, are they able to completely come out of the clutches of patriarchy?
Even though they have education and
Independence. Are they able to completely come out of the patriarchal society?
See, I don't think men or women are able to achieve independence, okay? I mean, one of the findings when you look at governance, for instance, is we say that women are proxy for men. So when you have reservation, the woman candidate represents her husband, right? We keep saying that as criticism. But who does the husband represent? Does he represent himself? Or his party, or his clan, or his community, or his caste, or his, something else, or the other, right? So I would not use independence either for men or for women. And I don't think, and this is autonomy is a better word to use, because, what are the frames within which you can make choices? And there, women's choices, the framework is narrow. Sundari Ravindran, in a paper in the EPW on Tamil women and autonomy, and she did field work, she says that this is what a woman told her, that things have improved. The line drawn is broader now, within which we can make choices. But those lines are still drawn by the men. Okay? Thank you. Now I think I am happy that you'll ask questions. Thank you very much.